Connecting with my friends, love it. Connecting with some sketchy guy that needs remote access to my computer, really?
We hear you. That's why AARP created the Fraud Watch Network.
If you don't think this is right for me when you think AARP, then you don't know AARP.
I'd like to welcome you all to the 11th Annual Louisiana Smart Growth Summit. In case you don't know, I'm Elizabeth Boo Thomas, the proud CEO and president of the Center for Planning Excellence. I think I'm such a great leader because I learned a long time ago to surround myself with brilliant people, and so that's why this conference is going to be so good. I thank you for honoring us with your presence. I think you'll find that the summit is going to cover the most pressing issues that are facing us as we learn to live with water and all of the other things that we have to deal with on a daily basis, and maybe traffic too, right? I would like to take a minute to recognize any elected officials or candidates for public office. Would you please stand and let us welcome you? LaDon Edwards. Upstairs, hey, Bruce Conkey, thank you. I also would like to thank the Board of Directors of the Center for Planning Excellence. I have a number of board members here too. Thank y'all for coming. I'd like to now introduce the Center for Planning Excellence's Board Chair, Cardell Heyman. Cardell has been the wise counsel and brilliant strategist for CPEX for the past 11 years. And has really helped us to become, I think, the very effective organization that we are today. Cardell?
Thank you, Boo, and welcome all to our 11th Smart Growth Summit. Just like to make a few sort of introductory remarks, if I may, to look at the context in which we're meeting. In many regards, this 2016 has been a bleak year for our state. We have the shooting death of Alton Sterling, which brought to the surface longstanding racial tensions and economic divides in Baton Rouge. The subsequent shooting of 6 of our police officers, resulting in 3 lives lost and 1 who remains in serious condition. 1,000-year flood events in both the northern and southern regions of our state, causing billions in losses and displacing thousands of residents and businesses. Updates to our coastal master plan, which have revealed that the threats to the viability of Louisiana's coastal lands and communities are even more dire than previously understood. These events have shaken us, bringing into stark relief the weaknesses in our social fabric, the vulnerabilities of our infrastructure, and dramatic changes to our environment. For many, the future seems uncertain. As 2016 draws to a close, we may be breathing a sigh of relief, hoping for better times in the next year. But hope is not enough. Better times require new solutions, smart strategies, stronger collaborations, and difficult changes. That's where planning and smart growth come in, bringing diverse stakeholders together to develop a shared vision for a better future and charting a path forward for implementing that vision. Center for Planning Excellence is always thinking about how planning tools and practices can help Louisiana create vibrant, inclusive, and prosperous places. Our commitment to sharing the best practices and new innovations in planning is reflected in the agenda for this year's summit. We are bringing you the best and brightest ideas on retrofitting suburbia, which you'll hear from shortly, integrating public health benefits into planning initiatives, taking resident engagement to new levels, building multimodal transportation systems of the future, and the use of creative placemaking to inspire communities, just to name a few. But this year, in response to the series of tragic events that have impacted us all over the last year, CPEX has added a resiliency track to our summit agenda. And if you look in your agenda, you'll be able to trace those programs that are part of that track. Those sessions will speak directly to the strategies, solutions, partners, and actions, and new ways of thinking that we must embrace in order to thrive amidst the changing climate, the shifting demographics, and economic volatility. You'll hear how we can work together to strengthen our infrastructure, increase social cohesion, adapt to change, and mitigate risk in a manner that improves quality of life and enables us to recover quickly when disasters do occur. This is a critical conversation. CPEX is honored to have the opportunity to bring the knowledge and expertise of our guest speakers to Louisiana, and we're very glad that you are here, especially many of you that I know have attended these conferences in the past. One of the things you'll have an opportunity to observe during this conference is the remarkable Cpec staff, which will be on display in many of the panels and other presentations that you'll be hearing. I'd love to have you recognize what an extraordinary staff we have assembled. Boo Thomas is an incomparable leader, and she has built around her a remarkable team. I particularly would like to recognize Jennifer Stenhouse-David, who has now for many years been the organizing power behind this conference, and she's done a great job once again. I'll close by reminding you that CPEX is a non-governmental nonprofit. It relies upon its membership for the financial support to keep this work going. To those of you who are CPEX members, thank you. We can't do this without you. If you're not a member of CPEX, I would encourage you to consider joining this effort. Thank you for being here, and I hope you will enjoy the conference. Now it's my pleasure to introduce James Slayton, who will introduce our first speaker. James is a new member of the CPEX Board of Directors, but he has been very involved with the planning of this conference now for a number of years. James is an attorney with the Stone Pigman Law Firm. He serves as the chair of the Land Use and Environmental Group of the American Bar Association Real Property Trust and Estate Law section. He's also a member of the Louisiana, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans Bar Associations. He's on the Lighthouse Louisiana Board of Directors and the chair of its Baton Rouge Advisory Board. He serves as chair of the CPEX Smart Growth Summit Planning Committee. So please welcome James Slayton.
Thank you. And all of Cordell said is true, but my main qualification for introducing our first speaker this morning is that I am, and have been for some time, a suburbanite, which is a bit of an embarrassing admission to a bunch of smart growth folks. But before I introduce our speaker, I do have a few off-the-cuff and completely spontaneous remarks that I've written down and would like to read. You know, if the late, great John Hughes taught us anything, it's that the suburbs are not as idyllic as they might first appear. Despite the manicured lawns, the soccer games, the carpools, those little automatic sprinkler things that go off occasionally and maybe at inopportune times, there's an undercurrent there in the suburbs of social isolation, alienation, and stratification, at least if you watch the movies of John Hughes. Anthony Michael Hall's character in Breakfast Club lamented this dehumanizing nature of the suburbs in his letter, read at the end of the movie, hinting at the social forces that caused each character to be viewed only as social archetypes instead of individuals. Now we know, of course, the real reason behind all of that social disruption. It's poor planning. I think we'd all agree with that. It's suburban sprawl. It's cul-de-sacs It's those ridiculous parking lots, and it's malls, 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 as far as the eye can see. Hughes' movies were, intentionally or not, cautionary tales about the ills of living in sprawl, detached from one another in the large community. Think about it for a second. Think of poor, disaffected Cameron in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, who's only happy when he gets to go into Chicago. Think of Clark Griswold and the madness he's driven to, trying to live up to the suburban ideal of family. Planes, trains, and automobiles, obviously a metaphor for the transportation challenges of living in the suburbs. And then think of Beethoven with Charles Grodin and the big dog. I'm not sure what it has to do with sprawl. I think it was just Grodin getting a paycheck, but that's a rare exception of the John Hughes canon, not being about suburban sprawl and urban planning. But while his movies are funny, and this analysis is obviously a little tongue-in-cheek, the problems created by suburban sprawl are not funny. They are real problems, and they've only gotten worse as they've fallen out of fashion and have been left, as new suburbs are created, the old ones left to rot, leaving gaping holes of blight in our communities, our cities and towns, and making these areas less prosperous, less efficient, less convenient, and less attractive, frankly, and weakening the strains of the community living there. But there is hope, and that's what our speaker this morning is going to be talking to us about. Our speaker is Ellen Dunham Jones, who asked that my introduction of her be limited to pointing out that she likes kittens named Snowflake as sort of a distillation of her personality and her being. I've done that now, but I'm sorry, but I will be fired from my job as moderator if I leave it at that for negligent moderating. So I do need to also point out that she is a professor of architecture and the coordinator of the Master of Urban Design program at Georgia Tech. She's an award-winning architect, a board member of the Congress of New Urbanism. Professor Dunham Jones teaches and writes about how the design of where we live impacts some of the most pressing issues of our times, reducing our ecological footprint and energy consumption while improving our health and communities and providing living options for all ages. I could go on because she's got an impressive resume and a number of accomplishments, but she will be frustrated with me if I do, so I will not. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That was a great introduction. Really, I do think all you need to know is I like kittens, but anyway. Good morning. I am delighted, I'm thrilled to kick off the Smart Growth Summit. And it is a little unusual, I think, for Smart Growth to really focus on the suburbs. So much of the attention is, of course, is to how we need to revitalize our urban cores and how we can actually do an amazing job with brand new high-performance greenfield projects. But I focus instead on that middle ground. I maintain the world's only database that tracks what I deem to be successful examples of dead malls, dying office parks, aging garden apartment complexes, strip commercial corridors, subdivisions, golf courses, branch banks, you name it, prototypical suburban property types that have been either re-inhabited with more community-serving uses, redeveloped into more compact urban places, or regreened, turned back to nature because we never should have built there in the first place. So essentially, I'm looking, I find all these examples of places that are aging, underperforming properties that now we have this opportunity for a fantastic do-over. We are able now, we built a lot of stuff that just is not aging well, and so I look at how we're turning those into more sustainable places. When my co-author June and I wrote a book on this subject, published in 2009, we had about 80 case studies in the U.S. I now have about over 1,400, and I'm going to show them all to you right now. No, but I had to limit the babies just to a few that I thought might be the most relevant, but really happy to share some of this with you. So let's see if this is working. All right. So before I get to the case studies, though, a little bit of background. I think everyone in this room is well aware that, most of the American population, by far, lives in the suburbs. The suburbs have provided generations of Americans access to the American dream, and many suburbs are beloved places. Most of those are the ones that were built in the 20s. The post-war suburbs, in particular, as I said, really were not designed to age well, and we're starting to see now a lot of those unintended consequences. And I think everyone familiar with smart growth is pretty familiar with all of these issues, but these really hit particularly hard, I think, in the suburbs. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but I think we're all pretty familiar with a lot of these unintended consequences. And what these are setting up is that we're beginning to recognize that there are 21st century challenges that the suburbs were never designed to deal with. So it's precisely because of these challenges now, as more of the suburban properties fail, frankly, now we have the chance to address every one of these issues. So a little bit more of the depressing background. Where are we now? We're at about a quarter of our enclosed shopping malls are doing gangbusters, doing really well. A little more than a third are kind of hanging in there, but fully a third are dead or dying. Strip malls, big box stores, we don't even know exactly how many vacant ones are out there. One of the more disturbing recent trends is rapid decline of suburban office. Corporate campuses and a lot of suburban office parks have been closing in the last 5 years as those same corporations that moved out of the cities in the 80s to the brand new shiny office parks now are moving back into the revitalized cities where the millennials, their employees they're trying to recruit are increasingly choosing to live. And, those office parks are not brand new and shiny anymore. So lots of, you can find this really depressing, or you can look at this as opportunity. This is now where, these are the properties that where we can begin to address some of the suburban problems. And what's really helping to accelerate that change are the really strong generational changes that are retrofitting the market for these properties. And again, I think most of us who have been, talking about smart growth are pretty familiar with a lot of these arguments. I want to point out the top one, though, because that one really surprises most of us. Most of us think of the suburbs as family-focused. Well, that's not who actually lives there. Since 2/3 of suburban households have not had kids in them. And it's because the post-war suburbs were built for the baby boomers. The baby boomers have, for the most part, lived and raised their kids in the suburbs, but the kids have grown up. The baby boomers are empty nesters, and they're still there, but there aren't any more kids. Their kids have long since left. Now, Gen X, the folks in their 30s and 40s, they're mostly in the suburbs, but they're a small generation. And they're raising kids, but again, they're a relatively small generation. Gen Y, the next really big demographic group, was 75% basically born in the suburbs, most of them wanting a more urban lifestyle. The trap that they're in is that A, they can't necessarily afford the more increasingly expensive downtown living, but also over 80% of US jobs are more than 3 miles from the central business district. And most of those jobs are out in the suburbs. So you've got a lot of millennials that want an urban lifestyle, but in fact their jobs are pushing them out to the suburbs. And eventually they're going to start having more and more kids, and they are also probably going to follow the schools as previous generations have. But you've got this convergence of the two big demographic groups, the baby boomers and Gen Y, the millennials. Both of those groups are kind of finding themselves wanting a more urban lifestyle in the suburbs. The aging baby boomers are, they loved the privacy of that single-family home while they were raising the kids, but now that they're increasingly hitting retirement, they're finding it pretty isolating. So many of the reasons that we were talking about in the Hughes movies. So a lot of baby boomers, they want to age in place in their same community, they want to have their same doctors and friends around, but they actually want to be able to walk to places. They poll at some of the highest levels, looking for walkability, bikeability. They want to volunteer, be engaged. So we're getting both of these groups looking for more urban lifestyles, but in suburban locations. And that's really adding tremendous real estate value to walkability, and especially in the suburbs where it's relatively rare. So Chris Lineberger, who I think has spoken at previous summits, has really been doing a lot of research on this, and predicts that 60% of demand for housing will be in the urbanizing suburbs for at least a generation, and most of that's because of the 74% rent premium on average across the country for any property that is in walkable urbanism. And so the market is really pushing. The market and demographics are very much pushing this stuff. So what are the challenges? Job one, we all know, is the reliance on the car. The suburbs are we're designed to be completely auto-dependent, and it's not easy to suddenly, try to make it more walkable. But there are a lot of strategies out there, and a lot of them are working really well. Now, sometimes, whoops, didn't go, okay. So sometimes it can happen kind of slowly and incrementally. This is one of the earliest retrofits. Mashpee Commons up in Cape Cod was let me see if I can get this to work. So it was this 1960s strip shopping center surrounded by an enormous amount of parking. The owners, over the course of 20 years, just started building on top of the parking lots a little New England village with apartments above the shops. At the time, a lot of people thought they were crazy, but in fact, it's now become the model for sustainable development on Cape Cod. And over the next 20 years, they're sort of building connected communities, much more denser kind of communities connecting to that original project. But building on top of the parking lots is a great place, great way to do it. So again, sometimes that happens kind of, incrementally. So here, Mashpee Commons, one of their strategies were little skinny liner buildings. These little guys, that they could screen the parking lots so that the experience of the street was still an urban, enclosed. The street feels like an outdoor room. Retail on two-sided streets tends to do a lot better than retail on a one-sided street. So you really get that urban feel, but they're designed to be so skinny that they're too narrow for the national chain retailers. These were designed to be small local business incubators that they tend to actually generate the highest sales per square foot, but they also have a high failure rate. So, and these little guys just could be moved around as the project slowly took over. So these kind of anticipating incremental steps, anticipating more and more urbanization are one of the strategies, especially in a sort of slow market or where, in their case, the regulations were really an obstacle to moving more quickly. Another anticipatory strategy is up here. This is Englewood City Center, about 10, 12 miles outside of Denver. It was a 3-story, enormous regional shopping mall. The mall died, and the department store was turned into, one of the department store anchors was turned into a new civic center. The site is right at light rail stop. So they've got urbanism kind of right at the station. But frankly, at the time, there just wasn't enough market for urbanism for the entire site. So yeah, over here is a Walmart, some out parcels, big parking lots, it's standard sprawl stuff. But they were able to convince Walmart. They knew the Walmart wouldn't be there forever, and they hope that the market will eventually expand. So they were able to convince Walmart to lay out its parking lot as future building sites. So the utility lines are put in right in the future streets. The street trees are aligned so that when Walmart's done, and they tend to have they don't tend to have that long a lifespan, those trees will be gorgeous. The site is ready for future urbanization. So these are some of the sort of modest, incremental steps that can be taken. Then, and sometimes, so it's both, it's working, then there's sort of somewhat more radical steps. I would call this a sort of in between. I love, this was a great project outside, in a suburb of Los Angeles, where the main street, shown up here, had been losing shops to the shopping mall for decades. And the answer had always been, well, let's widen the street. Let's get more people, make it easier for people to get to downtown. Well, all that did was make it easier to zip through downtown and not stop. So then they did the opposite. They did a road diet. They went from 5 lanes to 2, put the parking in the middle. So the parking is now in between street lights and street trees. So on ordinary days, you just turn in and park. The roads are now, they lowered the speed limit from almost 50 miles an hour down to 20. There's a saying, 20 is plenty, because if a car hits a pedestrian going 22 miles an hour, chances are you live. 23, chances are you die. We should never have speed limits higher than 20 miles an hour. Some places will kind of creep it up to 25, but in places that we're trying to encourage walkability and we want social activity. And what's interesting is that when you reduce the speed limit, well, they didn't actually reduce throughput, the amount of cars that were going through, because now the cars can go much closer together. They're more or less, they can be bumper to bumper. You're getting just as much volume of cars moving through. They are going more slowly. They have time to actually see, oh, there's a sale on at such and such, pull into the parking. And then on festival days, they've got this fantastic kind of space now in between the trees and the streetlights for sort of civic celebrations and festivals. And the results have been increases in property values, reduction in traffic collisions, new businesses. I mean, it's really been quite a remarkable project. And they didn't change the curb and gutter, so it really wasn't very expensive. They just put in the street lights and the street trees. Now, sometimes people go, there are projects that are even more ambitious, so to create walkable urbanism. This one, so if the last project was really public sector driven, this one has actually been that much more developer driven. The area is known as White Flint. It's not really a municipality, but that's the name of the metro stop on the Red Line. It's about a half hour outside of Washington, D.C. So there's the metro stop right along the 8 to 10 lane Rockville Pike. And it's your standard kind of commercial, suburban commercial district. I mean, there's some tall buildings there, but there's also little fast food. It's very auto-oriented. And yeah, there's this metro station, and you can walk. I've taken students. It's not very pleasant, walk alongside this 10-lane highway. But the county wanted to update their comprehensive plan, and so they contacted the 6 major property owners in this 400-acre area and said, look, we're about to do some planning. We want to involve you guys. And actually, the property owners said, hold off, let us have a take at it first. Let us just work. And the 6 property owners got together and said, 2 stops closer in Bethesda used to look like us. They're now getting rents 3 times what we're getting because they invested in walkable urbanism. And Bethesda is an amazing kind of before and after story as a small downtown that really doesn't have any more surface parking lots. They've completely built up on them. So they hired a very good Gladding-Jackson transportation engineering firm to come in and say, okay, how do we build a walkable street network on top of these supersized blocks, kind of big suburban properties? So all of the dotted lines are the new streets proposed. So the property owners have actually agreed to a 10%, approximately 10% increase in their property taxes to pay for the construction of public streets on their private land. And they've done that. It sounds great. Why would they agree to this? Because they know that they are going to get higher rents out of it. They're in a strong market, and they also know that if they now will be allowed to build up to 30-story buildings. At the same time, the public sector is committed, they don't have the funding yet, but to retrofitting Rockville Pike and putting bus rapid transit down the center, widening the sidewalks, and really making that a much more livable place. So here's the first 30-story building has been built. Now, if they go all the way up to the 30 stories, they also have to buy transfer of development rights from rural land in the county. So the county is really getting a win-win. They're getting higher density at transit and preserved countryside where they want it. This one, I think, just broke ground on the site of a former Chili's. This is right in front of that building. This is a bioswale alongside the sidewalk, right next to the 10 lanes. And remarkably, really beautifully done, beautifully detailed. It is actually pleasant to walk on that sidewalk, even though you're right next to this big highway. This is a 30-acre strip mall in its before condition. Here's what it looked like about a year and a half ago, and here's what build-out is expected to be. So this project is happening remarkably quickly. It's really it only took them about 6 years, which is fast in planning terms. I think because it was developer-led, and I think because it was 6 property owners. There's something probably sort of sweet spot about that. It was enough that they could spread the risk, but also not so much that they couldn't reach consensus. And White Flint's going to be a very interesting project to watch. So lots more one could talk about with auto dependency, lots of projects, but that hits some of the big ones. I want to now also shift to the challenge of jobs, because as I said, the suburbs, on the one hand, they are where the majority of jobs are, but we're really seeing that shift now as more and more jobs are returning to the urban core, which is great for the cities. We want that. But it's also leaving suburbs pretty challenged. To figure out how do they attract and retain the 25 to 34-year-olds, that key demographic. If you get those folks in early, they're likely to stay. Again, there's a lot of different strategies that are happening around. here in Baton Rouge, the Bon Carré Technology Center was a mall that died, and it has been re-inhabited with, I would argue, a much more community-serving use. It's got about 5,000 jobs in there, some of them quite high-tech. And it has helped to now spur a lot more proposals for a lot more new development and some new facilities, kind of to help around, sort of improve that neighborhood. And there's a lot of interesting kind of reinvention of the workplace that we're seeing. If the model of the suburban office park is the glass box, digital, living in cubicle, you work in cubicle land and you only go outside, you're in a hermetically sealed box, inside a box, surrounded by parking. We're starting to see a lot more office parks and workplace that almost looks like housing. This is a new project built outside of Los Angeles, redevelopment, but based on courtyards instead of cubicles, bringing people outside, really kind of merging much more a sort of a sense of domesticity, but also a sense of social communal interaction space. Really quite interesting. So in the meantime, we're starting to see that urbanism is the new amenity for the workplace. And so the older office parks are now trying to figure out, how do we urbanize? One of the more ambitious examples of this is the Domain, which is about 12 miles from downtown Austin, Texas. This was an IBM research and development campus. That's where the Selectric typewriter, the high tech of its day, a lot of us remember, came from. And it was laid out. That was sort of the manufacturing. That was the R&D. It's all sort of separated, big super blocks. The first phase was to build a street lined with retail, with apartments, and a few offices above, really to create that sort of create the urbanism. They've built a lot more apartments. And they've re-inhabited integrated some of the old IBM buildings into that. They're now building an enormous amount of office. They've already got one light rail line. There may be another stations being proposed here. The city is now projecting a lot, a really quite ambitious master plan at the complete, what they're calling kind of Austin's second downtown. And again, what's kind of key here is how much it's the urbanism, the creation of urbanism is what's really driving that reinvestment. The developers tell me they know that they can't compete with downtown Austin on the cool factor, but when Amazon was looking for where to locate in Austin, they kind of said, well, it's either going to be downtown or the Domain. Those are the only two choices they would consider. Part of the advantage why they did choose Domain was that Domain is at the sweet spot of all of the baby boomer generation living out in the suburbs don't have to commute all the way into downtown, so they're sort of commuting in, whereas the millennials living in downtown can take the light rail out, and it's right at that sort of end of the light rail on the highway kind of sweet spot. And we're seeing that in a lot of communities. The sort of merging the demographics with suburban locations that are urbanizing. Social capital is another, extremely, I think, important opportunity and challenge that the suburbs really were just designed on separating everybody out. Only the people who can afford 2-acre lots can live over here, and heaven forbid they come in contact with somebody who can only afford a 1/4-acre lot, let alone who lives in multifamily. And I think, the tragedies that Baton Rouge has suffered and the racial tensions just are playing out across the country in large part because of the lack of opportunities, especially in the suburbs, for people to gather, to get to know each other, to interact and socialize. So there are lots and lots of strategies that are being tried. I'm just going to show a couple. And one of the first, especially in soft markets, you really want to just boost your old downtowns. And one of the trends we're seeing is that as malls are dying, main streets are coming back. So in this particular case, this is on an older suburb, Pleasant Ridge, outside of Cincinnati, that had its downtown buildings were vacant. And then a volunteer group was dedicated to trying to just get businesses to come back into those buildings. And they did a really clever thing. They were able to get their entire little Main Street designated as a community entertainment district, which meant that the cost of getting a liquor license per business went from something like $25,000 to $2,500. They then targeted all the veteran food truck operators and said, "Are you getting tired of driving around? Would you like a bricks and mortar real location?" And they've been extremely successful at getting the food truck folks to now have their own physical shops. They even got a sort of guerrilla movie group that used to show movies out in vacant lots to find and re-inhabit the old theater. So re-inhabitation really is an incredibly important part of the story, I think, of retrofitting the suburbs. And we see loads of examples of this kind of one. This is a dead Walmart that's become a public library. In the process, they depaved some of the parking lot, put in a bit of a park, some bioswales, but they really just made a great gathering space, a public, civic amenity now in there, in the suburbs. We also see some interesting, in some of them, then the redevelopment projects, though, we also see a lot of really well done, I think, activation of that social space. This is the Mosaic District, which is about 15 miles outside of DC. It's 1 mile from the end of the line of a metro station, just a little bit far, but on the site of a dead Cinemaplex. And so the new anchor is a theater. So the theater sits on a public green, and the theater has a big LED screen on the outside, which also then they can program the yoga class, and activate the space. And they do all sorts of programming through that LED screen. It's actually been really quite surprising how much they'll show sports games, they'll have opera night, they'll do all sorts of things just using the theater. But the other thing they did that was really, I think, just a smart strategy throughout the project, they still have suburban big box, Target, for example, and they have some big office, actually, too, big floor plate office. But they put the big stuff above the little stuff, so that Target is, in fact, Target's up on the 4th floor, above 2 levels of parking, and then it's all small boutique retail at the ground floor. So that the walkable experience of the street is delightful. Same thing with the theater. The big boxes of the theater are above little small restaurants. Same thing with the office. So that you get the experience of walkability, but you also still have those kind of big suburban uses that are frankly necessary to the economy. And very much appreciated in many respects. This is another, so there's the re-inhabitation strategies, the redevelopment strategies, and then as I said, regreening is also incredibly important, and especially for increasing social capital. This is Guthrie Green in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This was not a very big, it's only 3-acre, but a truck loading site, a distribution center. So since then, it's been depaved, turned into a park. In the process of depaving, they also dug a whole lot of geothermal wells. And now the renewable energy that's coming from the geothermal wells goes to a nonprofit, and that helps support that nonprofit, and that nonprofit's job is to be in charge of programming all of the yoga classes, the farmers markets, the concerts, all of the social activities that happen in the park, which are essential. A good park nowadays, it used to be you just sort of build it and they will come. Now, if you really want the park to be that social energizer, that place where people can come together, you have to be able to pay for the programming. So it's a really nice case of sort of social sustainability and energy sustainability coming together. And it is now the hub of a new emerging arts district. A lot of new development has come in around the park. And we see that in lots of projects. But parks can also, this one's sort of a cautionary tale. I live in Atlanta. Dunwoody is one of the quite affluent suburb in Atlanta. And it's true they really don't have enough parks. So the Parks and Rec Department said, we really need a baseball park. And Dunwoody's pretty built out. So they said the perfect site would be this garden apartment complex. And yeah, there are a lot of garden apartments that frankly are aging, they're moldy, they're unhealthy, and we do need to replace them. And there are plenty of places that actually require, okay, you can rebuild, but you've got to have replace those units at the same rent. Unfortunately, none of those in Georgia. So here, this particular project was home to about 750 mostly Hispanic school kids. This was the one affordable housing in all of Dunwoody. And parks would be a good thing, but getting rid of affordable housing, we need to, at a time when we need to preserve affordable housing, is a very bad thing. It got enough bad press the day of the referendum, it didn't pass, and those apartments are still there, and actually they're in really quite good shape. But this sort of brings me to, the need to actually recognize the changing faces of suburbia. So there's a developer also from Atlanta. He started in Atlanta. He's now working with a lot of big malls throughout Texas, California. Jose Legaspi he finds the sort of dying malls and keeps a lot of the same old mall shops, Burlington Coat Factory, and places like that. But he also then converts the malls into really a Hispanic community center. So he has a Spanish-speaking pharmacy, a Spanish cinema, Spanish legal offices. Univision is his anchor in one of the ones in Atlanta. This one is in Fort Worth, Texas, and he has classes for after-school classes for school kids, and he always has a lot of event programming. So bringing up, whether it's bringing up Mexican wrestlers to perform at the mall, and he always, in his malls now, he has a house mariachi band, and then classes to teach mariachi, so that, really welcoming a lot of the new residents in suburbia in a way that, frankly, most suburban retail is not welcoming the changing faces at all. So this brings us also to the challenge of equity and affordability. Again, incredibly important topic. One of the earlier slides said, since 2005, more Americans in poverty live in the suburbs than live in cities or in rural areas. We really are it's kind of a somewhat invisible problem, but it's a growing problem. And that's before the recession, where the lack of access to opportunities, more and more people having to choose between, can I afford a car? Can I afford a house? I think if I have to choose, I'm going to live in the car, and because at least they've got an opportunity to try to access places. So increasing access, transportation costs are eating up a larger portion of incomes for the poor out in the suburbs than their housing costs. And we're really pretty screwed up on a lot of that. So lots and lots of different kinds of strategies again. This one is an example in New Jersey. This was one of the earliest Levitt towns. This one's outside in New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia. And this was their commercial, so there's the old sort of Levittown houses, and this was their commercial strip, had seen better days. By the 80s, it was already really dead. So they removed one building and built a town square, depaved quite a lot of the parking lot, put in bioswales to capture and clean the runoff. The old Woolworths became a library. This has become a big health center, and there's a community college has moved in, job centers. I mean, they've created a town center simply by, mostly by re-inhabiting some of the old buildings and then a lot of re-greening of the parking lots for almost no money. I mean, doing it really very, very affordably. For a community that really has lacked a sense of pride and much of a sense of places to go. This is in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, a relatively affluent community, but that recognizes they needed some affordable housing. And so they selected the auto body repair former parking lot, kind of right on the seam between a residential neighborhood and Main Street is kind of right here, as the location for affordable housing. The first proposal that came in was this one. Big, double-loaded corridor, hunker of a box, plopped on the site. Well, the neighbors freaked. They didn't want affordable housing in their neighborhood in the first place, and they sure didn't want something so out of scale with the rest of their neighborhood. So then they hired one of my former students who gave them a cottage court. The cottage court this is 15 units on 1 acre, and some of them are attached, some are detached. They have a little bit of a shared green space in the middle, but most importantly, they maintain the scale of the neighborhood, and they make this really graceful transition from Main Street into the neighborhood. No one has complained in the neighbors. They loved this project. This is an example of what a lot of new urbanists and others sort of call missing middle housing. Our culture at large, our society, we know how to build lots of single-family house. We know how to build the 5-story wooden apartment building wrapped around the concrete deck, so-called Texas donut. And then we know how to build high-rise housing. And we used to build lots of smaller scale, sort of, 2- and 3-story U-shaped apartment buildings. We used to build a lot of buildings that fit into neighborhoods because they still fit on on a single family lot. They might take 2 lots, but the grain of the neighborhood was preserved. We used to have much more of that sort of multifamily mixed in with the single family homes. And there's a lot of opportunities to kind of bring some of these types back and actually meet the need for a lot of aging elderly who live in the suburbs would much rather have a nice little small unit now that they don't really need the big house. Young people starting out often are finding these too. I mean, that interest in the smaller house is just coming back big time. One more example of kind of how to really boost some of our neighborhoods that need the most help. This is Wyandanch out in Long Island. It's the most economically distressed community on Long Island, really extremely poor African-American community. It has a Long Island Railroad station, but it was just surrounded by parking lots. And based on, there's always a really good champion for any kind of smart growth, or, you know, and in this case, county manager just said, you know, we've got to leverage this incredible railroad station. And so now they're building, revitalizing, connecting their main street, really rebuilding a lot around that the train station. And because, I mean, they didn't even have sewer at all. This was in this community. So now, because they have to put sewer into the new boulevard, that's how they're helping to pay for making it a true boulevard and really the anchor of the urbanism. So lots of really great projects. I'm going to rush through a few more examples. Public health is obviously another big challenge. I mean, we have always thought of the suburbs as healthy places to raise our families, but that's based on the 19th century idea that the cities are where we're going to get infectious diseases in the overcrowded cities. Today's big health threats are not infectious diseases, they are chronic diseases, and it's obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and these have to do with behavior. We've got to get people walking more. You know, suburban sprawl correlates with human sprawl, sad to say. So in Baton Rouge, the ambitious health district, connecting up several of the hospitals and medical offices in what is currently very auto-oriented into a more walkable place. Very ambitious plan, but a fabulous plan that really deserves some support. They also need to work on North Baton Rouge. More modest examples are things like this, taking an old big box. This was an old Costco that's now a gym. And they also de-paved part of the parking lot to put in playing fields. So getting the regreening benefits as well as much more physical activity. Public health also is, we need to deal with an aging population in the suburbs. The old model of the retirement home that's out in the middle of nowhere is not what the baby boomers are really looking for. They want to be more integrated into their downtowns. So here's Wayzata, Minnesota, little small downtown, and here was a dead mall that had been built on top of a wetland. It's now been rebuilt with senior housing integrated into the urbanism and extending the main street right into the project. And it leased up before they'd even started construction. There was just so much demand for so here's the senior housing that's very urban, but in a small town. Now, if we had time, I could also talk about all the energy kinds of opportunities that we have. I mean, the suburbs weren't designed to be energy efficient. And not that much has been done yet, but a few pilot projects here and there. And later today, not now, I'll talk about water, because that is obviously of incredible relevance here in Louisiana. Lots and lots of different strategies for how do we retrofit the suburbs to be much, much more water smart. So ultimately, the point is we really need to layer all of these solutions together. The suburbs were designed, and our whole disciplinary system is such that the transportation engineers do their thing, the planners do their thing, the designers do their thing. The school board does its thing, and it's not really integrated. And obviously, the more sustainable, more resilient solutions really require much more integration of all of these issues so that we can get some of those flooded properties or just plain, aging kind of vacant properties to be redeveloped into smart places. So with that, I'm going to close and again just say how delighted I am to kick off the conference and learn from everyone else.